This is the Reading Instruction Show. I am your host, the Genial One, Dr. Andy Johnson. Topic of today's show is called Context Matters. And this is the stuff we're going to look at today. But first of all, using crisis, or crisis is the context of crisis. One trick for getting things done is to create this crisis, and that's what has been done with the science of reading. This questionable claim that there is a crisis of reading achievement in the United States, that just is not true. NAEP scores from 1971 to 2008, you can see them there. Here is from 71 to 2012, ages 17-13. You see there's no crisis, there's no sudden drop in scores. They've been staying the same, if not steadily rising in some cases. Here you see from 71 to 2020. And here you see the different levels, basic, proficient, advanced. They are staying about the same from 92 to 2022. So this idea that there is a literacy crisis, the premise upon which much of the science of reading movement has been based, is a fallacy. It is just not true. It is a created crisis. A created crisis. Now, in a lot of states, like Minnesota, they use norm reference tests. The difference between a norm reference and a criterion reference, it looks at this normal population, the bell-shaped curve. And in a normal population, 50% is going to be below the mean, or the mean average. That's called average. That's called normal. In an average school, 50% of the population are going to be below the mean in their reading test scores. That does not mean there is a reading crisis. Now, a lot of state tests are criterion reference tests. They are based on an arbitrarily defined set of criterion. And that's what they use here in Minnesota. But who decides the criteria? Who decides the categories and levels within each criteria? Who decides the content of a criterion reference test? Let me show you. Now, reading is creating meaning with print, not sounding out words. We read for two purposes: to understand information and to enjoy books. That's the end state. That's the goal. What are the baby steps or objectives that lead us to this end state? Why is that important? Because that should be the reference, the criterion reference. Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment exams for Minnesota. They took the three-dimensional content, a core content state standard, benchmark standards. They took these. Now, a benchmark standard is what students should know or be able to do. Converted them into two-dimensional multiple choice criterions reference tests and gave them to students. They said all third graders should know these things. Somebody decided that, but who? And then I ask you, in your adult life, how often have you had to do any of these things? Remember, reading is creating meaning with print. We read to understand. We read to enjoy ourselves. We don't read to summarize from a section of text the central message or the plot or the theme or the topic. We don't read to distinguish among literary elements or differentiate methods of characterization. How often have you had to do that in your real life? Define meaning of literary terms like tale and moral? Who decided that third graders should be able to know or do these things? Who made that decision? How often are these done in your real life? Are these a means to an end? If so, what is that end? Now, in Minnesota, they say test scores are going down, but they never really report test scores. They simply give us percentages in 4 arbitrarily defined categories. We never see the test scores. They'll give us percentages at or above proficiency, but not a comparison of scores over time. So this idea that there's a reading crisis, certainly not here in Minnesota, certainly not across the nation. Even the NAEP categories. are arbitrarily defined, the levels and the content. So this idea that there's a reading crisis, we always have to question that. When people make baseless claims, upon what evidence do you make that assertion? We need to ask for specific evidence. Just show me one study. Many people are saying that. People are telling me, scientists say, researchers say. Okay, what scientists? Cite the research study, please. People make all sorts of claims. Whole language has been debunked, they say. Okay, well and good. Show me the research that shows that has been debunked. Don't quote a famous person. Show me the research studies. Remember, research is not research unless and until it has been peer-reviewed. Simply saying baloney a lot doesn't change the nature of baloney. Simply saying whole language has been debunked doesn't mean it's true. Show me a study, a research study published in a peer-reviewed academic journal. Context matters. Context matters. You can't truly understand the thing unless you understand the context in which the thing is found. That's true whether you're talking about letters, words, sentences, facts, data, reading curriculum, professional development programs. Human beings can't be understood outside of context, and research studies. For example, we all know the meaning of the word run, but in different contexts, it means different things. What is the context of letters professional development? And that's going to be the focus of this program today. Letters is a professional development program. It's owned by Lexia, which has an annual revenue between $100 million and $500 million, and I got that on Google. The parent group of Lexia is Cambium Learning, annual revenue between $250 and $750 million. Again, Google. And Dr. Louisa Moats, the author of Letters, is worth $20 million, and that's from Alexa app. Now, these aren't reliable sources of information, but as I'll show you, they're more reliable than Lexia or Dr. Moats. You cannot understand Lexia outside the context of its social, political, and economic context. You can't understand it outside these contexts. They're trying to, in general, disempower and control teachers. There's a movement to do this. There's a movement to delegitimize public education in favor of private. And there's a movement by Lexia Learning and Cambium to make money. Make no mistake about it, Letters is not an academic act. It's a social, it's not an academic act. It's a social, political, and economic act. It cannot be understood outside the context of money. Now, we all want to make good decisions. In education, to make good decisions, we need to know what's true. We have to have good information. But we need more than good information. We need information that's accurate, and not only accurate, but it's understood within the context in which it is found. For example, if you teach phonics, students are very likely to score higher on measures of phonics. That is accurate information. If you teach phonics, students will score higher on measures of phonics than those who have not been taught phonics. That is true, absolutely. But to understand these things, this does not mean that all students need heavy doses of phonics. Students will be better readers with more phonics. More phonics is better than less. Phonics is the key variable in learning to read. Anything other than phonics should be excluded. Phonics should be taught at all ages and levels. Phonics skills transfer to authentic reading situations. A skills-based approach emphasizing phonics is more important than a meaning-based approach. Phonics is necessary for all readers, and phonics is sufficient for all readers. We have to understand these things in a logical context, in the context. Yes, if you teach something, students are going to score higher on measures of that something. Absolutely true. If you teach one group something and another group nothing, one group is going to score higher on measures of that something. But that does not mean that something is good for anything. It could be good for nothing. And that's what these phonics facts need to be put in context. Yes, if you teach phonics, students are going to score higher on measures of phonics. That does not mean that these skills transfer to authentic reading situations. So let's look at the science of reading and the science of reading research standards. A lot of times people ask me, are you teaching science of reading? Are you a science of reading teacher? Do you teach science of reading in your methods class? Now, what do they mean by this? What exactly is the science of reading? Let's try to understand. The good Dr. Moats defines the science of reading as the emerging consensus from many related disciplines based on literally thousands of studies, supported by hundreds of millions of research dollars conducted across the world in many languages. My goodness, that sounds wonderful. Wonderful. Emerging consensus, thousands of studies, hundreds of millions of research dollars. Tim Shanahan, I don't always agree with him, but he offered a definition that gets us a little closer to understanding. Science of reading is applied research conducted in an actual classroom. Basic research is that conducted outside the setting in which it's used. That would be examples. Examples of that would be like brain research, eye movement research, miscue analysis. According to him, the science of reading should refer to all empirical studies related to reading, writing, and spelling. Empirical means it could be measured or observed. Now, that could technically include qualitative research. However, the U.S. Department of Education quashed that, defines scientifically based educational research is that which is evaluated using experimental or quasi-experimental designs. There's appropriate control, preference for random assignment experiment, and they contain within conditions or across conditions control. Now, a true experiment uses random design. Subjects are randomly designed to one group or another. Now, in education, we can't do that because students are in classes. So that's what's called quasi-experimental design. We can't randomly assign. We have to go where students are at. So we use measures like matching samples to ensure that the groups are the same or relatively the same. Now, the National Reading Panel, which Dr. Shanahan was a part of, they define the science of reading as any practice should be adopted widely to improve reading, a belief in the assumption or claim supporting the practice be causally linked to a particular outcome. The high standard for such a claim is an experimental study. Sometimes when it's not feasible to do a randomized experiment, a quasi-experimental study is included. So we can define the science of reading as using strategies and practices shown to be effective using controlled or quasi-controlled experimental or quasi-experimental research and conducted in classroom settings. That is the standard. However, that standard is not consistently applied by science of reading advocates when identifying problems and solutions. Science of reading, general consensus among researchers, strategies and practice determined to be effective using experimental or quasi-experimental research. Research will have established a causal variable between practices and outcomes, conducted in an actual classroom learning environment. That's the standard, and that's the standard that should be used to make all decisions related to reading instruction and policy. Now, I think that represents a very narrow view of what reading research is. It's a naive view. but I could live with it if, dramatic pause, the science of reading advocates would hold themselves to the same standards. That is, if mandated programs, curriculum, and policies were all based on that which was shown to be effective using controlled experimental research and conducted in classroom settings. I could live with that. However, it's not. Let's look at Dr. Moats. Again, literally thousands of studies, hundreds of millions of research dollars conducted across the world in many languages. With all these thousands of studies, we should be able to find at least one that supports letters' professional development. So in examining letters and research supporting letters, I was looking for controlled experimental or quasi-experimental research conducted in a classroom that created a causal link or showed a causal link between letters' professional development and A, teachers' ability to teach reading effectively, or B, readers' ability to read effectively. And I was looking for some research, some comparative research, comparing letters to other professional development programs. That is the standard, the science of reading standard. And we'll look at this in just a minute. Now, Dr. Moats would have us believe that if teachers just had the right kind of knowledge, her kind of knowledge, then they could teach reading effectively and all those pesky reading problems would go away, away, away. Now, they're partially correct. It's been well established that having a body of knowledge is an essential component of expertise in any domain, including teachers. Teachers need a body of knowledge. The real question has always been, what kind of knowledge? What kind of knowledge do they need? And Dr. Moats claims that she has the right kind of knowledge. Her kind of knowledge is the right kind of knowledge. So like Moses coming down from the mountain, she has given unto us the right kind of knowledge that will save us from our reading instructional sins. Well, let's look at the irrefutable logic of Dr. Moats. A, letters professional development equals B, more effective teaching. This is the basis, the logic upon which letters is built. Okay, A equals B. B equals higher levels of reading achievement. Okay, therefore, A equals C, letters professional development. Okay. A also equals D, the solution to all reading problems. Okay. A is greater than E, all other forms of teacher professional development for reading, and F is less than A. Teacher preparation programs are not doing their job. That's the irrefutable logic of Dr. Moats and her letters minions. However, there's a monkey wrench in the fly ointment. No causal link has been established from letters to B, C, D, or E. No comparative research has been created showing A is greater than E or F is less than A. There's a monkey wrench in the fly ointment. So, Andy's definition of science of reading would be this: you just can't say stuff. You got to back it up. So, specific research question. Standards. There should be a specific research question. It should be conducted in an actual learning environment, experimental, quasi-experimental design. Treatment should be linked to teacher effectiveness. The treatment should be linked to reading achievement. Treatment should be compared to something or else. When research is used to support something, it should actually support the proposition for which it was cited, and conclusions should be based solely on the data. Now, you'll see why this is important in a little bit. But let's look at using the teaching algorithm. An algorithm is a formula or a specific set of steps for solving a problem. If you do A, B, and C, you'll get to D. a step-by-step procedure that leads to a specific outcome. Now, we are familiar with these in mathematics and computer sciences. You put in the formula, it leads you to the answer. In education, the outcome is learning or reading. What are the steps? What's the algorithm that will lead to that outcome? Algorithms are very useful in mathematics and computer science where you have this nice controlled environment, but for humans in a classroom, not so much. It's an algorithmic approach. Now, these are all variations on the teaching algorithm. If all teachers would just do this, follow these specific steps in this order, that they are guaranteed to have learning at the end. Common assumption: if the algorithm is followed explicitly, students will learn. Teaching is just do this, a set of mechanistic steps. You follow the steps. Solution for all problems is to follow the algorithm and eliminate the teacher. Who needs a teacher when you have an algorithm? Who needs a teacher when you have an algorithmic-based reading program? And if students don't learn, you either run them through the algorithm again or find another algorithm. And structured literacy is a variation of the teaching algorithm. And the algorithm, most of these are simply direct instruction or the elements of effective instruction. We have the input, modeling or demonstration, guided practice, independent practice, sometimes assessment, but review and revisit. Now, direct instruction, everybody believes that direct instruction is important, but it is a pedagogical strategy, one strategy in a list of others that all teachers should have. It is not a method or approach. Whole language teachers, balanced literacy teachers use very direct and very explicit instruction as part of a comprehensive reading and program. It is not the method or approach. Direct instruction is good for teaching skills. It should never become a method of teaching reading. But yet, that's what often happens. Some examples of past algorithms: Benjamin Bloom in 1956, you identify measurable objectives. You teach towards this measurable objective. Learning is a behavior. If you can get students to demonstrate the behavior, then learning has occurred. And this is great for mice who have been starved and are in a Skinner box, but not so good for human beings in a classroom. Learning is never whole and complete after a single encounter, and behaviors don't reflect cognition. Robert Major, same way, preparing instructional objectives, task, goal, performance, and get them to display the behavior. Robert Gagne's a same thing. Conditions of learning, 9 steps. It's an algorithm. Do that and you can be guaranteed that learning will occur. Guaranteed. B.F. Skinner, his behaviorism. Now here's the thing about B.F. Skinner and his behaviorism, operant conditioning. It's the only research that has been conducted on one species, rats, mice, and pigeons, and applied to another species, human beings. There's some good stuff in behaviorisms, but it should be a way to understand. It should not be an approach or a method of teaching. It's an algorithm, like Madeline Hunter's lesson plan of the 70s, the 7 steps. And by the way, she never designed this to be an algorithm. It was to be a vehicle to have conversations about teaching. But it became an algorithm and then a method of evaluation, and all teachers had to try to squeeze their lesson plan into this cumbersome algorithm. Now, it's helpful if applied flexibly in certain situations, but it is a form of direct instruction. And you can find plenty of research to support the importance of lesson planning or planning a lesson. But there's no research showing that one lesson plan is better than another lesson plan, that the Hunter lesson plan is better than the Johnson lesson plan. The same with the Danielson framework. And she never meant this to be an algorithm. She meant, like Hunter, for this to be a way to have a conversation about good teaching. She had her 4 domains for teaching. And this, by the way, is a very top-down, teacher-centered approach for teaching. 4 domains. The 4 domains were broken into 22 components, and the 22 components were broken into 76 teeny tiny elements. And if you look at it and examine the research, which we must do, each of the 76 teeny tiny elements were supported by research, yes they were, and put on a 4-point scale and used to rate teachers. But if you actually look at the research, you see a Motes-like interpretation, that the research does not really support the claims it claims to support. And putting together 76 teeny tiny research elements does not make the whole thing research-based. And the basic science of reading standards was never applied to this research. And is Danielson better than some other lesson plan format? That research has never been conducted. And Danielson said herself, you cannot break the complex act of teaching down into a set of skills. You can't do that. So let's take a look at some primary research conducted by Dr. Motes. Again, we're looking for letters and causal variables. That's the science of reading research standard, linking letters professional development to A, teachers' ability to teach effectively, or B, readers' ability to read effectively. And we're looking for controlled experimental research conducted in a classroom comparing letters to some other form of professional development. Now, here are 3 things to consider about research. Research is a process of asking questions, collecting data using some systematic plan, a research method, and using the data to answer those questions. But conclusions should be based solely on the data. It should be based solely on the data. You can't collect data and make conclusions on something else. That's called baloney, where you collect data and then you say something else completely unrelated to the data. And that's what Dr. Motes does a lot, and what her research does a lot. She makes conclusions based on things outside the data. Yes, you should be able to make logical inferences. That's what a conclusion is, based on the data. But research should have conclusions that are based on the data, and that's why we have peer review. Baloney-based conclusions are problematic because, in the case of Dr. Motes, she'll say something, and then people will say, see, research supports baloney, when that's not what the data said at all. You can only make conclusions or logical inferences based on the data. And that, by the way, is the importance of having a specific or clear purpose when conducting research and when reading research. When you're reading a research article, you should always look for that specific question or purpose, because you are conducting the research, you're gathering data to answer that question. Was it conducted in an actual learning environment? That is applied research versus basic research. And we talked about treatments and whatnot. If it's using to support a proposition, like Dr. Motes will use, does the research cited support the proposition for which it was cited? Or is it just being cited? And are conclusions based solely on the data? Now let's look at this 1994 study. This was cited in her white paper, 2021, found on the Lexia Letters website, Literacy Professional Learning, 10 Reasons Why It Is Essential. And this study was used to support 2 propositions. Number one, teachers need more training in phoneme awareness and phonics, proposition number one. Proposition number two, many adults who become teachers of reading do not have fully developed phoneme awareness or an understanding of why words are spelled the way they are. These are propositions, and this is the research cited to support those propositions. But if you actually look at the research, surprising things happen. This research consists of a self-selected population. 89 students in 6 different sections were taking an elective course, reading, spelling, and phonology. Now, they're taking this course because they want to know more about these things. But Dr. Moats created a survey about the things they were going to learn in the course and said, aha, these students don't know enough about what I think is important. And in this selection, this self-selected population, there was an equal distribution. Yes, there were classroom teachers who actually taught reading, and some reading teachers, which I guess is reading specialists. But there were classroom teaching assistants, which are paraprofessionals, graduate students, and speech language pathologists. So it's a self-selected population, no randomized control, certainly not in a classroom setting. She gave a survey or a test what she thought was important. I think this is important. And by the way, when you look at a comprehensive reading program, this is neither necessary nor sufficient to teach reading effectively. Know the 6 syllable types. Explain Greek spellings. Please, please. All right? Neither necessary nor sufficient to be an effective teacher. It wasn't really research. She just gave a survey of what she thought was important, and then she wrote a bunch of stuff. And people looked at the stuff she wrote and said, aha, research supports that teachers aren't being prepared. That's what she's doing. This study is often used to generalize about teachers' knowledge and teacher education programs based on surveys. Based on surveys. This is the second one, a 3-year study. 50 kindergarten, first and second grade teachers given a survey. Year 2, 41 second and third. Year 3, 103 third and fourth. Survey, survey, survey. And not surprisingly, she found surprising gaps in teachers' insights about learning to read. Meaning they didn't know the things that she thought they should know. I think they should know this. Oh, they don't know that? I am so surprised. Okay? Now, in the abstract and discussion of this research article, she went beyond the data. She tried to make connection to students' reading achievement levels and teaching competence. But these were part of another study. So let's take a look at what she was trying to do. She was trying to make the connection. If you have my knowledge, students are going to have higher levels of reading achievement, and teachers will be able to teach better. All right? For teacher competence, she rated teachers. Teachers were rated on a form that she or we, that they developed. Checklist of 29 items. They would rate them on this checklist. Now, this does not demonstrate efficient teaching of reading. This is going back to that algorithm. It's forms of direct instruction where the teacher is in control. It's top-down, teacher-centered form of expository teaching. Direct instruction. Very much like Danielson and Hunter, it is a teaching algorithm. Nothing related to reading instruction here. They were rated on and by the way, her approach to teaching is an algorithm, and they were rated on an algorithm. So of course, if you took her course, they're going to score higher on your subjective ratings. And for reading, she used 3 subtests of the Woodcock-Johnson test. I don't know why she chose these 3, probably because they scored higher. But letter word identification, naming letters and reading words aloud from a list outside a context, so you can't use syntax and context. Passage comprehension, orally supplying the missing word removed from a sentence or a brief paragraph. Okay, you can maybe make a case for that. And word attack, reading nonsense words from a list. All right, decoding and sounding out words is different from creating meaning with print. Does it meet the basic SOR research standards? Certainly not. Certainly not. What about, I did a search in the Minnesota State University search engines looking for letters research. I found none, but I did a Google search and I found letters efficacy research published on the Lexia website, which is owned by Cambium Learning. Now, we would think that these would demonstrate efficacy research, the causal link between letters and teachers' ability to teach effectively and readers' reading achievement. And one would think, since Dr. Motz is part of that, that one could find at least one of the literally thousands of controlled experimental research comparing letters to other forms of professional development. That is the science of reading standard. So let's see what they found. They came up with only 18 research studies that, quote, constitutes the evidence base for letters. 18, that's all they came up with. And of these 18, they had 3 categories: peer-reviewed research, third-party program evaluations, which isn't really research. Research is not research unless and until it has been subjected to peer review, and doctoral dissertations. And these are pretty pathetic as well, and I'm only going to evaluate the one area: peer-reviewed publications, thousands upon thousands of studies. Well, they came up with only 2 that were published in peer-reviewed academic journals. Peer review. Let's look at the first one, 2011. Now, the Letters website described each study, but there is a difference between how Letters described the study and the abstract. In this first study, Letters described the study using the term letters 5 times in 138 words, whereas Carlisle and Verbitsky used the term letters 0 times because the study was not about letters, but compared literacy coaches to no literacy coaches. The results suggest benefits of a model of professional development in reading that include school-based coaching for first-grade teachers. Yes, but this research study had nothing to do with letters. It was about coaching. The second one, again, the letters description mentions letters. The actual abstract doesn't mention letters at all. Why? Because the study looked at reading programs with explicit instruction and compared children with learning disabilities and speech and language disabilities to those without. It wasn't about letters. Again, it's misapplying research to make whatever point you want to make. You can't make research say anything you want, but you can misapply and misinterpret. That's what Dr. Motz does. That's what the Letters efficacy research does. And none of this meets the basic science of reading standards. So why is Letters, why is Lexia Learning, why is Cambium given a free pass? Why are they not held to the same standards as classroom teachers? Conclusions. You can use all the sciencey words you want, but it doesn't make it scientific. You can do complicated statistical analysis of baloney, but that only gives you statistically significant baloney. There is no causal research that I have found. If you find some, send it to me, linking letters with teacher effectiveness or student reading achievement. If you find it, send it to me. There's no research comparing letters professional development with other forms of professional development. And there's no research comparing letters knowledge with other types of knowledge. Orthographic mapping may be a thing, where words are mapped in long-term memory, but semantic mapping is much more of a thing. Yes, orthographic mapping is true, but in the context of semantics, it's much less impactful. When you hear the word cat, you don't automatically associate with short A words or the AT phonogram. It's the semantic mapping with cat things, pet, furry, kitty, cat food. That's where your brain connects with. Dr. Moats either doesn't know better, or she knows better and does it anyway with her misuse and misapplication of research and research result. I don't know which of these is more disturbing. Always question the premise of the science of reading claims. We do not do that enough. Always look to see what was measured and how when you're looking at research. And always look to see who was and wasn't included in the population. All right, this has been the Reading Instruction Show. As always, I'm your genial host, Dr. Andy Johnson.